Greetings, netizens of YouTube. It has come to my attention that Sargon of Akkad has released another video in his series against progressivism. Rather than address his video named Liberal Ideas in a blow-by-blow fashion, which is, quite frankly, beyond my technical capabilities and would go on for too long, I will offer some objections to his points and provide my own. First, I'd like to tackle the term Neoprogressivism. In his first video in this series, Sargon, claiming just seconds previously to be examining the topic from a liberal perspective, uses a description from the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to include a description from the French Zionist political philosopher Bernard-Henri Levy. He uses neoprogressivism interchangeably with left fascism, as the Wikipedia entry explains. Bernard-Henri Levy, a philosopher and journalist, calls the political hybrid neoprogressivism new barbarism or red fascism. Levy argues that it is anti-liberal, anti-American, anti-empire, anti-Semitic and pro-Islamofascist. Telos, the critical thinking journal website, reviewed his book Left in Dark Times. Levy writes, "To the neoprogressives, America starves the world and floods it with goods, fights terrorism and incites it, has no culture and imposes its culture, worships materialism and succors spiritualism, and comes too late to fight Hitler and then uses Hitler's methods." It is interesting that Levy implies it is not possible to fight terrorism and also incite it, that it is not possible to flood the world market with goods and yet to force poor nation states to accept unfavorable trade deals. He suggests it's not possible for American society to worship materialism and for the same society to push back against that with all manner of spiritual ardor. In fact, I'd suggest that most people understand it's possible to do both. This binary mindset of the anti-neoprogressive seems to cross the Atlantic, although at least Levy lives in France, a country where socialism has a strong tradition and both progressivism and anti-Americanism has influence. So in his society there may be at least some merit to such a critique. Of course, this isn't the case in most countries on Earth. So-called neoprogressives do not occupy positions of power, whether in Washington, Berlin or London. Clearly, the popularity in sections of outside society for progressive ideals lies in the fact that liberalism has repeatedly failed to deliver the reforms needed to enable a more just society. We have seen this tendency with the succession of left-leaning or green movements over the past 20 years, and we can see it with the appearance of political leaders such as British Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and American Democrat candidate Bernie Sanders. In fact, many people today can barely tell the difference between a liberal party and a conservative party in their countries. But rather than examine the failures of liberalism, critics of progressivism want to focus on those reacting to those failures. Is progressivism responsible for the many thousands killed in wars around the globe? Is progressivism to blame for global poverty? Is it responsible for the economic policies that caused the bitterly deep recession we are still emerging from? Is it responsible or supports the cuts in essential public services as a result of that recession? Is it to blame for the inequality we still see in society? Is it responsible for the increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots? Which ideology argues for the elimination of the ethical dimension from decisions like selling arms to the highest bidder in the global market? Which ideology argues that global aid should be cut so it can be spent on defense? Which ideology allowed for the banks to lend and take absurd risks without sufficient regulation? Which ideology argues for only a bare minimum of public services on an ideological basis rather than reacting to the needs of citizens? You can't tell if I'm talking about conservative ideology or about classical liberal economics? That's exactly the rub of the matter. The lines between liberalism and conservatism have become blurred to such a degree that to many people the only reasonable position has become progressivism. This is a topic I will return to with supporting evidence. But let's return to the document. What evidence does Sargon's Heritage Foundation article use to prove its narrative of insidious progressivism taking hold in the corridors of power in Washington? In the past 2 decades, a new, more radical form of progressivism has taken over American social and political life, even finding its way into the White House. Fresh instances of this new progressivism appear every day. For example, at the 2012 Democratic National Convention, progressives officially supported same-sex marriage as a civil right and unofficially rejected the word God in their platform. President Barack Obama, labeled the first gay president by Newsweek for his support of gay rights, has instructed the Attorney General of the United States not to defend the Defense of Marriage Act. And Vice President Joe Biden has said that discrimination against transgendered persons is civil rights issue of our time. Notwithstanding these earth-shattering examples of the Red Menace, it is unclear whether this attempt to label today's progressives as neo-progressives will succeed or not. For the time being, I see little to no distinction between the criticism levelled at neo-progressives and that levelled at progressives. It is for this reason I will continue using the word progressive. The debate between collectivism and individualism is indeed archaic. My first bone of contention is the entire implied premise that collectivism represents progressives and that individualism represents liberals. Bear in mind that liberals represent the political centre. We are talking about political concepts rather than the US political system, although it's easy to argue that today's US Democratic Party is not centre-left either. First, individualism. The concept of individualism is supported by Ayn Rand, Margaret Thatcher, philosophers such as John Locke, and even religious right-wingers such as Ted Cruz and Paul Ryan express enthusiasm. With the exception of Locke, none of these figures can be described as moderate or centrist. Clearly, individualists cover a range of economic and political philosophies, and it's simplistic in the extreme to frame the individualist camp as a liberal one when there are as many conservatives and free market libertarians that support it. Rand. Individualism holds that a civilized society or any form of association, cooperation, or peaceful coexistence among men can be achieved only on the basis of the recognition of individual rights, and that a group as such has no rights other than the individual rights of its members. No trades unions there then. It's also pertinent to remember that rugged individualism is an important part of the famed American national character. This is something American politicians have repeatedly attempted to exploit, whilst the idea of the collective has been rubbished and discredited as un-American over generations. But let me also frame this argument in terms that a number of free market apostles see it. Individualism is another word for unregulated free markets, and collectivism is another word for government. Margaret Thatcher. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves, and then after our neighbour. And people have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations. A little further on, she repeated her point, using the exact words, "There is no such thing as society." Collectivism. When you consider more carefully what individualism alludes to, a number of contradictions become apparent. If individualism doesn't really mean liberals, is it possible that not all progressives are collectivists? Well, yes. Socialists argue that modern capitalism and private property based on socialized production or corporate ownership structures is a form of organic collectivism that sharply contrasts with the perception that capitalism is a system of free individuals exchanging commodities. Many Marxists also reject collectivism on similar grounds. George Orwell, a democratic socialist, did caution against the tyrannical dangers of collectivism, but warned that the tyranny of the free market was an even worse option. So the obvious question arises: is the choice between individualism and collectivism a false dichotomy? And isn't it true that most people fall somewhere between individualist and collectivist? Certainly, most people do not naturally follow an ideological mindset and often hold contradictory views. I, for example, would be quite willing to concede that the trades unions, a collective, in the United Kingdom from the 1970s to mid-80s had too much power. But the idea of the collective that secured fair wages and working conditions denied to workers by business as somehow infringing the rights of individual businessmen is utterly absurd. And it's not as if non-union members didn't benefit from improved working conditions and wages. This argument is all the more pertinent considering there is evidence showing that Thatcher's desire to destroy union power in the United Kingdom was motivated by her devotion to classical liberal economics. Part 2 to follow.